But first, our big discussion this evening. President Trump has halted all military aid to Ukraine, freezing arms shipments, and a lot more. But what we'll be looking at on this program is also a key decision which he has taken. That decision has to do with tariffs, and one that has impacted China, certainly. It has impacted Mexico and also Canada. How is it going to potentially impact India? Remember, India also involved in trade talks right now with the Minister Piyush Goyal in Washington. But to look at Trump's tariff diplomacy or aggression, call it what you like, we're joined by Dean Baxendale, Jonah Blank, Ajay Bakka, and Nicholas Nugent. Thank you all very much for being with us. Dean Baxendale, let me come to you first. You're a columnist in Canada. The relationship between Ottawa and Washington, perhaps the worst it's ever been. How does this signal perhaps the latest low in this relationship, where a US president refers to Canada as a state and the Prime Minister as being a governor?
Yes, it's very disappointing that Donald Trump and ultimately the negotiating team behind him have tried to leverage Canada in this rather obtuse and undiplomatic fashion. The reality is that Canada, along with Mexico, have been significant, obviously, trade partners and allies in multiple wars over the past 80 years. I think that discounting it all for the transactional nature of what Donald Trump is trying to leverage on the economic side is a fool's game, but ultimately he believes he's in a strong position in which to do so. So here we find ourselves at a very low point. And you know what Trump is looking for is national economic security. He sees three goals here from what I can ascertain from my discussions with Washington today, and that is the following. One, they want the Keystone pipeline put back on the rails, and that this pipeline would then feed into U.S. Texas refineries. That provides economic security from an energy perspective for the U.S. Number two, he wants Canada to go along with the tariffs on China, additional tariffs, which isolates China, which is really the target of all of this. And number three, as you know, around fentanyl. Mexico extradited, I believe, 21 different criminals. Canada has a number of individuals that are targets of FBI, DEA, and other investigations that the Americans want extradited to the United States to face charges. It's a question of whether or not they're willing to do that. We appointed a new fentanyl czar last month, in part to placate Trump. But here we are at a whole different level. This is economic warfare, and Canada needs to be strong.
Jonah Blank, how do Trump's tariff wars, in a sense, signal a departure from multilateral trade frameworks like the World Trade Organization, the WTO, reflecting a broader shift towards unilateralism in U.S. foreign policy? In other words, how is this move not isolated? It's part of something which Trump is pushing.
Yes, thank you, Vishnu. It is part of Trump's, I'll call it an agenda, but we really shouldn't think that there's a whole lot of strategy here. It's based on profound ignorance and vibes. Everything Trump ever does in any aspect of his life is governed by two things: transactionalism, that is, what's in it for me personally, and ego massaging. How does this make me look and feel? And the ego massage is really fundamental to this. He's constantly trying to bully and humiliate America's friends and partners. This is obviously not a strategy. That's not really how to win friends and influence people. Why does he do it? Because it makes him personally feel good. There isn't really anything he's asking for in these tariffs. He just is using a tool, a powerful weapon that he does not understand for reasons that do not advance American national interests.
Ajay Bakka, how does this potentially impact India? Our Minister Piyush Goyal is in Washington now. We'll be looking at tariffs among many other issues, but you know, with India's agriculture sector, our pharma sector, our IT services sector, having strong business in America, do you feel that there may be trouble for New Delhi?
I think there will be some agreement that gets hammered out. India is number 11th on the trade gap, hierarchy. So the first three countries are China, Mexico, and Canada. So Trump is going down the rank. And we rank at number 11 at about $41 billion of a negative trade gap with the US. We imported about 650 million barrels from Russia of crude oil and 64 million barrels from the US last year. So one way out is clearly to buy more US crude if it's available. I think as Europe has been offering, same the offer from India will be on the table. Second, if you look at the Indian tariffs, those can be removed quite easily. It's not that big of an issue. That big an issue. Today also you have anything from California, almonds to pistachios to anything available in India. And I think there will be some kind of a soft agreement with India. If the worst case scenario happens, 25% tariffs come in on 2nd April, then the GDP impact, Vishnu, is about 0.5% over the whole year.
That's fairly significant, isn't it?
It is, because overall 18% of Indian exports are going to the US. So if you get, but it's a worst case scenario. If it's a reciprocal tariff, like I'll give you an example of pharma. We are sending generic pharma formulations worth about $8 billion to the US every year. We get advanced drugs for cancer and other advanced treatments of 600 million, on which a 10% tariff is there. That can be very easily removed. It's a 60 million outgo for India, but on the other side, it's $8 billion. So textiles, again, we are a big importer, gem jewelry. Electronics, now something like iPhones, we are sending nearly now $5 billion worth of iPhones assembled in India. If there is a 25% tariff there, I'm sure the US corporates will also try to talk some sense into the administration. But it is a 0.5% in a worst case scenario, which we don't see happening, unlike Canada and Mexico, which again we think might be a negotiation tool. Today, the Commerce Secretary was on a US business channel and he said it's a drug war, it's not a tariff war. So it's total confusion and on the spur of the moment, whatever is most expedient is being done. There doesn't seem to be a strategy behind it. Looking at autos, for example, the same auto part might be crossing from Canada to US to Mexico, and then the automobile might be coming to the US. You would have 4 times tariffs being put on the same auto car. So it's going to destroy that industry. 8 million cars are getting imported into the US. And we are seeing European car makers down 5% today, American car makers down 1.5% to 3%. So it's not so easy, this multilateralism, which has worked for 100 years, to unravel it overnight like this. It's not that simple.
Okay. Nicholas Nugent, just looking at the larger issue, in what ways do these tariffs, in a sense, embody Trump's America First doctrine, where he prioritizes economic nationalism over traditional alliances? And if that is the case, how is this fundamentally altering America's global leadership?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question because, frankly, tariffs have not hit Europe. Tariff increases have not hit Europe yet, though there's a fear that they will, especially European Union. That doesn't include the UK, of course. But a much greater concern here at the moment is the bigger question of, is the Western alliance, NATO, coming undone based on what Mr. Trump's had to say over the past few days, and indeed his acrimonious relationship towards President Zelensky of Ukraine. So that's what's hitting our headlines and our concerns. And I think what combines us all, I should say, is unpredictability. We're in a state of enormous unpredictability with the new American president. Perhaps Canada and Mexico and China saw those tariffs coming, but it's been a bit on-off. And I think I was very interested in what the Canadian contributor said. I was in Canada myself recently, and the impact could be enormous on a country that has such a close relationship. But, you know, it's coming and going, and it's clear that there is a political agenda. In other words, Mr. Trump was keen to specifically to limit immigration, illegal immigration into the United States, and to tackle the fentanyl crisis. And certainly Mexico appears to be responding to that, which is the main problem. But those aren't quite such big issues with Canada, as I'm sure your contributor will say. And there it's much more about cars and car parts and oil and such forth. I'm not qualified to talk really about that, but we are in a state of enormous uncertainty, and that applies, I think, to all of us, and it applies especially to us in Europe, where we're hoping to see the end of one of the most serious conflicts in the continent in recent years. And it's very, very difficult to see the pathway through that, with policy from the United States apparently changing by the week. It's different from last week now. It seems more serious than last week. So I really don't know where we're going. I don't think any of us know where we're going, but we're all rather concerned about these spot decisions to increase tariffs, or the other big news story today, to cut armaments towards Ukraine, which has enormous impact on not just Ukraine, but on Europe as a whole. So as I say, that's what we're concerned about here at this moment.
Mr. Baxendale, how does the use of tariffs as a foreign policy tool, which many of you have been sort of making that point, in a sense, under Trump, redefine American relations with both adversaries and partners like Canada, and sort of marks a pivot from diplomacy to economic coercion? A lot of people don't really understand if this makes any sense, but it is coercion in a sense, right, Mr. Baxendale?
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think you could actually view the tariffs more as a punitive sanction against Canada for not complying with Donald Trump's wishes. I think that, we're in the age of a disruption. We're no longer in the age of certainty. Donald Trump and his team are rewriting the rules. The fact that, he would have in the UN side with Russia, that they were not the aggressor in the Ukraine war, is absolutely an incredible piece of statecraft, to which I think we are all looking at the implications, as some of the guests have mentioned, regarding NATO, trade alliances, et cetera. I think in the end of the day, this will ultimately backfire on Donald Trump and the Americans. He can wield his short-term power. Our premier from Ontario, for instance, Doug Ford, has already threatened to cut off the power. And if we cut off the power, we are the major supplier for energy, for electricity, for Pennsylvania, New York State, Ohio, Minnesota, the whole Northeast through Quebec Hydro. It would really have serious repercussions. But this is going to affect Americans, as a number of your guests have already said. This is disastrous, in terms of the number, the trading relationship. We're $3.6 billion each day. That's 1.3 trillion in two-way trade between America and the United States. This is going to hurt Americans. It's going to bring up the cost. It's going to hurt Canadians. People are going to lose their jobs. And for what end? To alienate a once great trading and great ally for freedom and democracy. This is absolutely absurd.
Jonah Blank, there is, of course, the entire China angle, and we should speak about that. How has China's counter tariffs and export controls on critical materials, for example, tungsten, escalated what is a huge tech rivalry between America and China?
Well, this is a very good point, because tariffs are a weapon, but they're basically a weapon inflicted upon one's own citizens with the goal of also hurting someone else's citizens. The United States can use this weapon effectively, to some degree, against smaller trading partners. Canada and Mexico both are much smaller economies. China, however, is not really a smaller economy. In some ways, yes, in some ways, no, but it's a peer competitor. So the US really can't bully China nearly to the extent that it can bully its friends and partners. What this means is that the pain inflicted on Americans is going to come home to roost much more quickly for China. For example, my kids' college fund declined by 2% overnight because of Trump's tariffs. When the market crashes, as it did today, that's a reality check that Trump won't be able to ignore for long, and it's really China more than the smaller partners that will be giving him this reality check.
I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us. It is the latest well, a lot of people would say confusing sign in international politics right now, these tariff wars, where is it all headed? But a lot of you were referring to Ukraine as well. That's been the biggest story.